Thank you very much. I think we've listened to three very insightful and inspiring presentations that should provoke a lot of interest among you and engender a lot of comments and questions. Before, however, I open up the floor, I wanted to give the panelists a chance to have just a brief conversation among yourselves. Is there any point that you want to engage that was presented by your co-panelists? Oh, so, Will, I saw your hand first, and then Bobby, so go ahead.
Yeah, largely to nod my head in agreement, but I'll be more articulate than that, I hope. One is to echo something Bobby was saying, is that this is, although Trump really puts a fine point on it, as Sahar was saying, it's also the case that the Obama administration was not exactly going after right-wing extremists or terrorists either. They were very gun-shy about this. And so, in a way, sadly, politically, it's okay to go after Muslims who are espousing extreme ideas, but it's not okay, domestically, politically, to go after the right wing. And I think part of the prison that they had put themselves in was this construct of countering violent extremism, which the bland label suggests, oh, you want to go after all sorts of extremism that is encouraging violence. But when it's only applied to one community, then in a way it's almost as insulting as being more explicit about which community you're truly worried about. So I don't want to let them off the hook easily, just because the current incumbent of the presidency is more extreme in the language that he uses when talking about the problem. I think it's also worth remembering that the current president has not been yet tested by a crisis that isn't of his own making. We have not yet had a major terror attack in this country on the level of, say, a San Bernardino or in Orlando. I hope we will not be tested in that way. I fear that we will be. Last year, ISIS carried out a series of spectacular attacks around the world during Ramadan, which is coming up. This is a time historically for the organization they see as an opportunity to demonstrate their strength. I'm worried they will attempt it again. And God knows how the president will react to it. And I am very worried about the dynamic that we have seen for the last 15 years, where there is a very provocative attack designed to create an overreaction, and the government then complies, which further compounds the problem and creates a more fertile ground for recruitment. We often, I think, elide the fact that we are in this predicament, not wholly, but largely, because of the 9/11 attacks. And they were deliberately designed to create this kind of overreaction. ISIS has put an even larger target on the backs of Muslims in this country by being very explicit about their attacks as Islamic. As misguided as that is how they frame it. Having followed this issue closely for years, I can tell you that while there was ambivalence and even suspicion about Islam after the 9/11 attacks, after San Bernardino and Orlando, it is through the roof to a level I have never seen before. And that kind of paranoia has an effect. And regrettably, some of the young people in this country carrying out those attacks in the name of those organizations are doing it to fuel it. There is a case of a young Somali, I think from Ohio or Minnesota, excuse me for not remembering the specifics, but the letter he put out during the attack was, I'm doing this so it will cast suspicion on my fellow Muslim community and alienate them and turn the government against. I mean, this is cynical, sick stuff, to say nothing for how the government overreacts and plays into this propaganda. Finally, I want to echo Bobby's point about local solutions. It is very difficult to deal with this issue in a productive way in the federal government for a lot of reasons that go beyond the current administration. I won't prolong things to get into the nitty-gritty, but needless to say, it is a far more useful and effective endeavor to work at the local level to make sure that people are reaching out across the aisles, across their religious communities, to others outside, to make sure that there is a productive response whenever there's an attack, and also to ensure that positive stories that have nothing to do with terrorism are being highlighted, at least at the local level.
Okay, thank you for that. Bobby, you had a comment?
I'm going to pass, actually. So
You're okay now, okay.
Yeah.
Sahar, go ahead.
Yes, I just have a couple points. So first, I agree that Obama's administration does not have clean hands. I think if we're going to give them praise, it will be that they didn't make things worse, but they definitely didn't make things better. I think what Obama did that was a significant shift from his predecessor and certainly from his successor is that his rhetoric was more measured, more articulate, and more reasonable. The critique that many of us had was that his rhetoric didn't match his practices. And words matter, and rhetoric matters. It's not everything, and we certainly want practices to reflect that. But to the extent that there was a base of people who held very strong Islamophobic views, they are being emboldened and expanding. I think much of the Islamophobic views that people had was actually really veiled anti-black views, because Obama's victory as the first African-American president created some serious cognitive dissonance among many Americans and really brought out a lot of racism. But because it wasn't politically correct to be so overtly and openly anti-black, it was to be anti-Muslim. And so much of the anti-Muslim and Islamophobic sentiments that have increased are kind of connected to anti-black sentiment. So it's very complicated because of his identity and the identity of his father in particular. I just want to, I do agree with you, Bobby, and if you will, in terms of the local efforts. Actually, Brookings has a study that I often cite, I think it's from last year, that shows how Republicans compared to Democrats have something about a 20% difference in terms of their negative views. However, they did another study where they asked people who actually knew Muslims, who had interacted with them either superficially, and then another question was for those who had a friend who was Muslim. And the numbers went down by 10 to 20% for both Democrats and Republicans, but particularly Republicans. So you are correct. The more that people on an individual level interact with the other, the more that the propaganda and the ideology is not as effective in indoctrinating or brainwashing them. The problem that Muslim American communities face is there are only 3 to 6 million people in a country that's over 300 million. And so that strategy, if you're representing the communities, is not an effective one. It's one that there's no harm done and you absolutely should be engaged in your community. But that is not, it's impossible. So that's why the federal level, the media, all of this kind of high impact action or events are so important because they have a much bigger impact that can supplement the local. And then finally, with the local, at the local level, you have a fundamental conflict or tension between the structures of these fusion centers and the joint terrorism task forces, where you have local, state, and federal counterterrorism working together on surveillance, on prosecutions, on investigations, on the one hand. And on the other hand, local police trying to have healthy, functional relationships so that people do, in fact, report crime, whatever type of crime it is, whether it's terrorism or non-terrorism. And the same problem you have in immigration. And that's why a lot of local police departments they actually support what's known as a sanctuary city. It's actually not a sanctuary city, but they support this concept of not reporting people who are undocumented to ICE. And so I think that is just for my and you can respond, but I think that's also a fundamental challenge because people have Brennan Center did a FOIA and they found some evidence that some of the information that's gathered from these community outreach meetings between local, state, and federal, that some of it is going into intelligence databases, or they don't know. It's being retained. And once it goes into a database, then you don't know if you'll end up on a watch list, on a no-fly list. A threat assessment will be opened against you, so it can get really complicated.
So just to be clear, when I'm talking about local level activity, I'm not talking about anything in that vein. I'm talking about getting out and voting for the local school board, for the sheriff, who's ever running for sheriff, who's running for mayor. To Will's point, this idea of trying to identify, highlight, and amplify stories, I think this matters big time on the local level. And to two of the examples that you used, and I agree, there's no question that national discourse matters. When we have our leaders, political or otherwise, out there saying good or bad things, people listen to this, but it's at the local level that people interact with Muslims or Jews or Hispanics or whatever the case is. And those interactions matter a lot. It's also at the local level where mayors are saying, we're going to have a sanctuary city. We don't care what the federal government says. This happens at the local level. It's at the local level when very smart folks in DC think we can set up 3 pilot programs, CV pilot programs. And they think, we're going to fashion these in a way and we're going to do X, Y, and Z on the ground, but it's on the ground when local communities say, we don't want this, that you're able to push back. And so I don't want to get into a debate about how important or unimportant the U.S., the federal government is, but I am a big, big believer that it's at the local level that the most important work gets done. But back to Will's excellent point, I think there are so many stories, and also to your point, Sahar, about Muslims are between 3 and 6 million. It's a small community, but there are a lot of positive stories out there that nobody knows about. And I was in Orlando 2.5 years ago, and the Muslim community there had collected funds to buy used bikes to give out to poor inner city kids, irrespective of their religious background. Up in Flint, the local Muslim community has led the way in trying to provide clean water to folks, irrespective of their religious background. And I think it was 2 years ago, Muslims in Southeast Michigan raised over $100,000 to pay the water bills of poor Detroiters whose water was being shut off by the city. And these are just a few examples, but these examples, we don't hear about them. And when I was up in Flint recently, I'd asked him about a young man who's, at the time he was, I think, missing and on the run, but the FBI was looking for him as being an ISIS recruiter. And I was talking to some of the leaders there and said, we've never met this guy. We don't know who this guy is. We know his family is, but we don't know him. And they say, the media covers this. The FBI is up here asking about this. But they said, why aren't they asking about what we did to help poor, residents in Flint get clean water? And so I think, it's at the local level. If we can find ways to elevate some of these positive stories, I think that matters a lot. But so that's just to, when I'm talking about local level engagement, I'm not talking at all about CVE. I'm talking about the full range of political and civic life.
Okay, well, I'm sure that's an excellent springboard for your questions and comments. Now, we have microphones. There's one over there, and I would ask you to step up to the microphone, please. Please identify yourself. Tell us who you are, if you're representing an organization, and I do implore you to keep your questions and comments as succinct as possible. Otherwise, I will cut you off.
I assure you it's going to be a very short one. Thank you. My name is Salah Sarhan. I'm ambassador, represent the Arab League mission in Washington. I would like to thank you so much for your introduction. Also, I thank William and Sahar for their presentation and the gentleman. Actually, I would like to talk about the Trump next visit to Saudi Arabia, which is going to be the first trip for a new president. As we had, I know that any U.S. president will go to Canada or Mexico the first trip, but now he's going to Saudi Arabia. And I heard what Sahar said, and I heard what William said about the terminology and how he describes our religion as radical Islam. We didn't overreact that, and because we are tolerant, we don't want to talk about that. But now, I would like to ask, who was behind this visit? Who motivated? Who changed his mind? How on earth? Is it only McMaster that he motivated him to go to Saudi Arabia? I don't want to talk about the weapon deals between the United States and Emirates and Saudi Arabia, because Trump is going to meet with 28 leaders, Muslim and Arab. He's not going to talk about weapons. It's going to be a good and positive message he's going to deliver to these people. So please tell us who was behind this and what you expect from this visit. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure who's behind it or if it's the best idea. I will say on the reason for the trip, of course, as Sahar said, it has a lot to do with finishing an arms deal, and this is not only important for Saudi Arabia's security needs. This is also about jobs in the United States. Remember, a lot of this money is going to be plowed back into arms manufacturing in this country. The Saudis have pledged to invest in infrastructure here. So this has very much to do with domestic politics as well. Not to say it's right or wrong, just pointing out a basic fact. And this has been well reported. This trip is also, of course, about Iran. Iran is not being invited to this event. And it is also ostensibly about counterterrorism. And we hear reports that the president is going to speak about Islam. As someone who wants to see this trip go well, I hope that this talk does not happen because it is so fraught with danger, for rhetorical danger for the president. I have to say, internally and secretly, I very much want to see what he says on this topic. I'm morbidly curious to see how it goes.
So I don't want to speculate either as to who was behind it. I think that we are still learning a lot about the idiosyncrasies, to put it charitably, about this new president, and trying to understand, is there anything consistent that one can identify in his behavior and his choices. But I think he's open about the fact that he's a businessman at heart. And so to be sure, part of the reason I think he's going to the Middle East is because that, at least with regard to the defense industry and with regard to even investment there, although most of the money now, Saudi Arabia used to be spending more of its money investing across the world, and now it's spending most of its money on military purchases to fight what I think is a losing war in Yemen, what they call Saudi Arabia's Vietnam War. So they have a demand. There is a demand, and we have a supply, and we want to compete with any European competitors. So I think that is part of it. He also is going to, he seems to have a belief that he can somehow appoint his inexperienced son-in-law to be the mediator between this decades-long conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians. So he also wants to, I think he wants to be a historic figure in that regard. And he wants to be able to deal with the Saudis as well as the Israelis. I mean, this whole Abrahamic faith tour. So that might also be a theme, although I think that's more of a political cover, because ultimately what he really wants is business. With regard to his speech, I would not be surprised if he changes his tune, because this is a man who used to be a Democrat and then became a Republican. I mean, this is a man who just changes his views randomly, and he's very unpredictable to the extent that some psychologists have questioned his capabilities. So, I mean, it's very problematic. So I think that he's not the type of person that would stick to his guns on, well, not to use that terminology, but somebody who would be consistent. So he might go there and never even use the word radical Islamic terrorism. He knows his audience, and ultimately he wants to get the deal done and get to yes. And then he'll come here and he'll engage in his Islamophobic rhetoric for the audience here and his base. So this is not somebody who really even cares if someone calls him out on being inconsistent, and he'll just tweet about it.
Bobby, did you want to add anything, or?
No, I think
Okay. All right, I'm going to move to my left side now, please.
I'm Ahmed Ahmed with the Minaret of Freedom Institute, and I would like to tie a point that was made in this panel with one made in the previous panel and invite you to elaborate on it, because I'm concerned that in the desire to get the Egyptian and American styles of government to be more similar, we're moving America to be more like Egypt rather than Egypt to be more like America. In this panel, the point was made that by targeting small minority, you can target small minorities in ways that you can't target the general public. And in the previous panel, the point was made that there is an attempt to transform a religion into an ideology, because you can't discriminate against religions the way you can discriminate against ideology. So what I want to do is invite you to comment on how the phrase radical Islamic terrorism is in service of that other point. And in the context, I would myself point out that I think it's served to, for example, silencing articulate intellectuals in the Muslim community, like Samuel Arian, who was held in jail for many years and now is out of the country. It's been used against non-Muslim advocates for Muslims, like Lynn Stewart, who spent many years in jail. And I think that it's also perhaps behind the FBI's sting operations, which have been called manufacturing terrorism, by going after some perhaps unstable people in the community and actually convincing them to get involved in terrorist activities.
Is that directed toward a particular panelist, or in general?
It's really to all of the panelists. I think each one might want to answer it in a different way. For example, the anthropologist might want to say, apart from local political activity, what other ways we can try to stop this trend.
Thank you. Okay. In any order?
I'll have a go. Just a quick point, and it's a simple one you've no doubt heard before, but extremists feed on one another. I mean, it is the jihadists who have been promulgating the idea that Islam is a political ideology. They insist on it, and they push back against other Muslims who say, no, it is much more than that, or it's not simply that, or it isn't that. They insist that it is. And then, of course, the extreme in this country will pick up on that and say, see, these people see their religion in the right way. It is a political ideology. And in many ways, they feed on one another. And it's a very difficult conversation to interrupt because they are feeding off of one another. And how can you productively insert some facts that can't be twisted to fit this model when you've already subscribed to it. So I don't see it going away anytime soon. But we know that when there are attacks, it of course makes this framework much more appealing to the extremists in this country, because they can hold up the religion and say, look, it is in fact an ideology that these people are carrying out, and we have to treat it as such. It is not protected speech.
So I think what's happening post 9/11 is something that's been happening since the beginning of the country's founding, which is what we call racial projects. The war on drugs, the war on crime is a racial project. Immigration reform is a racial project. It's effectively where you have these facially neutral endeavors or government programs. Welfare reform is a racial project that are effectively targeting communities or individuals based on an immutable characteristic, and it is engendered or it's enabled and facilitated as a result of racial disparities, bigotry, racism, xenophobia, things that are perhaps even for some people in their subconscious, and for some people it's very conscious. And if we understand the war on terror as a racial project, then it's very predictable and very unsurprising. And then we need to oppose it in the same way, which is identifying that it is a politicized, racialized enforcement program, as opposed to this neutral project of, no, we're really just worried about the security of the country. We're not, if it was really about the security of the country, it would be focused on mass shootings and gun deaths and also, there's many other forms of violence that are killing Americans at much higher rates than terrorism, at least in the United States. And if we really cared about terrorism, we would be focusing on a diplomatic solution, not a military solution, to the Middle East conflict that's killing hundreds of thousands of Muslims. One thing I want to just, I thought about after I answered your question, in the fight against ISIS in Syria and Iraq, where does most of the support, at least from private donors, come from for ISIS? Saudi Arabia. Well, who supports? I mean, this is a problem that a lot of Middle Easterners talk about, at least at coffee shops, which is the ISIS conflict is part of a larger sectarian regional conflict. And Iran has its proxies, and Saudi Arabia has its proxies, and Russia has its proxies. You know, there's a lot of Chechens that came in to Syria, and Assad has, you know, so it's very complicated. And it's a little bit ironic that President Trump is going to Saudi Arabia to fight ISIS when Saudi Arabia is known for siding, not necessarily ISIS, the organization, but at least supporting Sunni militias and Sunni militants, which may or may not be ISIS, against Shia militias and the Assad regime. So the whole, and this cynicism that I'm expressing is very common in the Middle East. And I think this is where Americans, at least the grassroots, is very naive in taking this counterterrorism, national security rhetoric at face value. And there are a lot, it's much more complicated. There are more financial interests and political interests at stake, and that the American people, I think, are being hoodwinked.
Yeah, I mean, just briefly to echo there. I mean, to Sahar's point, I mean, there's 30,000 people a year that die in the U.S. from gun violence. I mean, hundreds of thousands over the last 10 years. In terms of just this rubric, radical Islamic terrorism, I mean, this is a domestic political device in my mind. I mean, this is something that gets people at a local level fired up when they hear our leaders or folks running for office say, you know, radical Islamic terrorism is a threat. But I mean, since 9/11, I think the number's just under 100. Maybe one of my panelists can correct me if I'm wrong. Since 9/11, I think just under 100 people have died in the U.S. from jihadi terrorist acts.
94, yeah.
94 in the U.S. 94 people total compared to 30,000 a year from gun violence. And so, but radical Islamic terrorism sounds really scary if you're watching the news. Mm-hmm. You know, and that's not just Fox News. That's CNN. That's right across the board.
Okay. To my right.
Right.
Yes, go ahead.
Dina Abdelkader from the University of Massachusetts, Lowell. I'm also a research affiliate of the Center for Middle East Studies at Harvard University. My question really pertains to this panel as well as the panel previous to that one. You talk a lot about, and I quote here, spreading awareness, alternative habits, as Dalia said. And it's really difficult at a time where academics are moving post-relativism, are becoming very polarized. And I'm not talking about the usual culprits, Daniel Pipes and such, but on a very small level, talking again about the local level, where this has been sanctioned by the policies to be able to basically protect yourself and say that, no, this person's opinions are irrelevant because we've moved to a stage where the rhetoric is also affecting academic institutions, and how you see that playing a role in changing things.
Again, directed at any particular panelist?
Anybody who wants to answer that.
Okay, you've been volunteered, Sahar, I think.
The academic.
Well, legal academics are their own creatures because we are trained to be advocates, and we train our students to be advocates. You know, I think there's going to be, I don't have an answer to your question. I think that the polarization in the United States has affected various entities, various groups. And one can argue that perhaps this is something that even predates this recent election cycle. But to the extent that we are concerned with so-called fake news, or we're concerned with the way in which information is expressed and communicated to the public, I think we should focus more on facts and studies and research, and that may in fact be a reason, all the more reason for academics to be more involved in these debates or in these discussions, at least by doing the research and showing whether or not it supports the polarized rhetoric. So that doesn't answer your question because I haven't done a survey of the entire academy. But I think a lot of people who care about the facts, whatever they may be, are very concerned with the factless types of discussions that are being had in kind of the public arena.
So in the interest of time, we'd like to end as close to 12:30 as possible. The 5 people at the microphones will take your questions all together at once, and we'll stop it there. So why don't we start on the left, and then we'll turn to the right and take all your questions at once.
Okay,
Yes.
I'm glad to start at the left. My name is Ibrahim Hussein. Can you hear me? I'm Egyptian American from Egypt, and I have been in younger days a student of Hassan al-Banna, the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, and the whole term of Islamic radicalism, I never heard of it until recently. And it is really unfortunate because the whole ISIS movement and all the radical movement destroys an image of a great religion, a faith of peace, Islam. That means peace. And I'd like to know from the panel that the leaders of the Muslim countries and the institutions like Al-Azhar say enough thing to condemn ISIS and condemn violence associated with Islam. Did they speak up? Did they say they defend Islam?
Okay. Thank you. Next.
Thank you. Mary Masmoudi, I'm with CSID. I wanted to ask your opinions about how student groups, Muslim students in particular, should handle sort of these CVE programs that are coming to some of our universities. I'm an alumnus of University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and we have one coming very soon, unfortunately. And we tried to fight against it. We tried to get this proposal rejected, but many of my friends who are still on campus worry about their professors, about their fellow classmates, about interactions with local campus police, about how their lives will be affected. And we have friends in New York, for instance, who told us about the relationship with the NYPD and the profiling program that of course was over many years. So I wanted to ask, what kinds of things would you suggest to these students to do? How might they act? How might they protect themselves and their dignity and their integrity as young American students on a college campus, of students of faith? And so I would invite all of the panelists, please, to give us your opinions. Thank you.
Hello, Michael Berninger from the International Center for Religion and Diplomacy. And my question is probably best in your camp, Mr. McKenzie. What do you feel are the most important institutions and resources at the local level to positively transform interfaith relations, specifically around fear and prejudice?
Okay.
Yes, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Samar Chatterjee, Safe Foundation. I just want to point out a comment that Bob McKenzie made on Peoria, Illinois. It has become forgotten as a Republican test case. In the 70s and in the 80s, every Republican president or politician, when they wanted to test a policy, they said, let's see how it plays in Peoria. Well, we've forgotten that. That doesn't happen anymore. but you gave an example where the Muslim community is living in peace with the American white. I still think this country is predominantly owned and operated by majority whites. So it's a white American country as such. However, we are here, and I find, like, I'm not a Muslim American, I'm a Hindu American, and I find that Americans, when they make a choice of people, they always make who is extremist and who is not before
May
they
I
hire people.
ask you to get to your question, please?
All right.
Yeah, in the
So
interest
given
of time.
that there are always whipping boys in America, America has always been like this. Whether it was in the 70s, the blacks were the whipping boy, then came the Iranians as the whipping boy. Today it's the Muslim Americans. Just live with it and it'll be all okay. America has lived this way.
All right, so that's just a comment. All right, thank you. Go ahead.
Bob Shadler, former CSID board member. Thank you for your panel. Reference was made that the Democrats are in a hole right now. They lost about 1,000 state legislators. They have only a handful of governors. They lost the House, they lost the Senate, they lost the presidency. So I've heard a lot of complaints about radical Islamic terrorism as a phrase of political rhetoric. The alternative seems to be, so far, violent extremism. If you were advising politicians to get elected at the state, local, or national level, what would your positive recommendation be for their rhetoric? Would you say, keep talking about violent extremism, use the phrase radical Islamic terrorism, don't speak about terrorism at all, or do you have an alternative that you think would help politicians get elected?
All right, well, thank you for all that. I'm going to ask you to briefly respond to all of the questions as you take your turn. So I'll start with you again.
Okay.
Will?
If I could, because the politics one, that's definitely going to Bobby. But on the question about have any Muslim institutions condemned ISIS? Yeah, for sure, tons of them. I read these in Arabic. I'm not familiar with the ones in English. I just assume they're out there as well. They're okay. They suffer from an apologetic stance that sometimes undermines the critique because they, in trying to blow holes in what ISIS is teaching, they sometimes go in the opposite direction and saying, you know, nothing they're doing has anything to do with any part of the tradition. And by not having a full and frank conversation in these critiques, it ends up undermining them for their intended audience. Many of them, you know, are other Muslims living in Arabic-speaking countries who are familiar with the tradition. So I would say if there's any shortcoming, it would be that, but I'll leave the politics to Bob.
Okay.
So with regard to the question about essentially political Islam from the gentleman who's Egyptian American, I think that political Islam, which I just use this term because the way I define it, people who are Muslims but believe that their religious faith and principles inform the way in which inform their politics and their political platform. So their counterparts in the United States are evangelical Christians who would like public policy and laws to be influenced and informed by their religious beliefs. Right? It is not an inherently pernicious thing. It's just it's a worldview, and you could be of any faith. So I don't use political Islam as a slur, but more as a descriptive term. Political Islam is a threat to authoritarians in the Middle East, to every regime in the Middle East that's not democratic, because for various reasons they have been the most successful in mobilizing people in the nonviolent democratic process. That's why the Muslim Brotherhood was designated as a terrorist group in Egypt, because they won the elections and they essentially defeated the secularist or the military regimes at their own game, at the nonviolent game. So if you are an authoritarian, your biggest threat is your political opposition. And what the regimes there have done is they have manipulated, at least the American people, and one could argue even the policymakers and elected officials, ignorance about the region and ignorance about the religion to have us do their dirty work for them. Right? What they want is the political Islamists to be annihilated politically. And 30 or 40 years ago, it was the national liberation folks, it was the nationalists, it was the socialists, it was the communists. Anyone who was going to threaten an authoritarian political system. And because we have such ignorance and bias against Islam, and it's complicated with our history, we kind of fall into that, and there are interests that converge with that. So, we just need to accept that these are political conflicts, and religion is effectively the currency or the ideology that's being used in an otherwise political battle for authoritarian control. With regard to the CVE question, I think that ultimately people within these communities have to decide between their different options, and I think it's, I know what I would do, but I don't feel comfortable imposing that on others, but I think the three options are boycott and refuse to participate. The second option is participate and hold them accountable and be somebody who's on the inside that isn't going to be co-opted, and be cognizant and aware and informed that these are very problematic, highly flawed systems and programs, some of whom, some of the results are inadvertent, some are intentional. Or you can be an external watchdog, which is effectively someone who doesn't participate and doesn't necessarily boycott in terms of shutting it out, but issues freedom of information requests, issues all kinds of requests for information to which you have a rightful access to because federal funds are being expended on that program, which will keep those who are participating hopefully on their toes so that they either don't do anything that violates people's rights, or if they do it, they do it in a smart enough way to hide it, which is also possible. So my work on CVE is very clear, and I would certainly be someone who would be, I'm a critic of CVE for various reasons. With regard to the condemnation of ISIS, I just find it to be futile, and I'm interested to hear other perspectives, because when Muslim American organizations condemn ISIS, one, the American public doesn't believe them, so they haven't won that audience. Second, those who are vulnerable to being recruited don't see them as credible voices. These are individuals who are often, either they have a mental health illness, they had a personal crisis, they have a very superficial understanding of Islam, and they are already anti-establishment, for lack of a better term, very cynical about mainstream Islamic institutions, and that makes them easy prey for ISIS, which is anti-establishment. So I'm just not sure how effective it's going to be, and this is where it makes it a lot more complicated in trying to do any form of intervention. And also, the core issues are often social, economic, political, psychological. I mean, there's, as you know, both of you know, there's a huge debate in the academic literature about the causes of terrorism, and nobody has come up with anything definitive and dispositive. And it's very, very local and sometimes even individual. So there is no panacea, there's no magic pill that says if we do this, then we can, we go to the root of the cause of terrorism. It's very complicated, so all these calls for condemnation, it's like, fine, you want to condemn it, but I just don't see it as something that is effective beyond perhaps affecting those that might be on the fringe of going. And then with regard to what I would call it politically motivated violence, because that's what it is. So if you're thinking about countering violent extremism, the reason why I have a problem with countering violent extremism, and this is the American in me and the lawyer in me, is it's okay to be an extremist, particularly in America. The First Amendment is aimed at protecting those who have unpopular views. You don't really need First Amendment protections if your views are mainstream. The First Amendment is there to protect those who are dissidents, those who are outliers, and those who the mainstream would call extremists. What you can't do legally is engage in violence, right? Incite violence, imminent violence. And so from an American perspective, it's problematic to criminalize being an extremist, because at some point that's criminalizing dissent. But you cannot engage in politically motivated violence, which is effectively what many of these groups do, whether they're right-wing, hate groups, the Ku Klux Klan, ISIS, they're politically motivated and they're engaging in violence in pursuit of that political ideology.
Thank you. Well,
Sure. I don't want to stay in the way of people's lunch. I think we're around that time. So I'm going to give 3 super fast responses here. First question to the student here asking about CVE programs being imposed upon you. Everything, I would echo everything that Sahar would say, but frankly, I just wouldn't engage in it if you don't want to do this. I mean, this is where the local level matters. Back to my earlier point, folks in Washington, D.C. can fashion some great program, but if nobody on campus wants to get involved, then guess what? It goes nowhere. It's dead. It's done. I mean, that's a fact. And so but I would also say, and this sort of ties into the gentleman's question about institutions as well, but I mean, if I were all of you guys, I mean, I would be knocking on every other student organization's door and saying, we don't want this. This is being imposed upon us. Will you stand with us? And I suspect, especially on a college campus, that more often than not, these student organizations will stand with you. I mean, but that would be, I mean, my advice is don't engage. And to your question, I think it really is going to be bespoke for each local place. But I think that different communities are coming across. I mean, I'm going to be in Houston on Monday for a dinner that's being pulled together by a full range of communities. The Jewish community, the Indian community, the gay community is going to be there, talking about how, at a local level, the city can better engage with Muslim Americans. And they've got a table of 25 different leaders coming to try and wrap their minds around this because they're concerned about populism on the rise for all the obvious reasons. And so I really think this stuff happens very, very much in the local level, and I'm not trying to downplay the importance of this horrible, toxic discourse that we hear from some of our elected officials. But Donald Trump can say, I'm not going to allow X, but guess what? Its mayors are saying, no, we've got a sanctuary city. Bring on the lawyers. Final question, advising politicians. I know at least 2 of us on this stage have advised one person who ran unsuccessfully for president last cycle. And we talked about some of these issues here. And I've talked to a number of other individuals running for office and who hold office about what to call this. And I just I'll give you one quick example. Last September, I pulled together a high-level event up in New York on the margins of the UN General Assembly, and we had Antonio Guterres there, who's now the UN Secretary General. And we had David Miliband, and both of them, independent of each other in the green room, said to me, they said, in reference to Brexit, they said one of the big mistakes is that politicians on the left were dismissive of the so-called crazies. And, of course, I think looking back now, we probably were very dismissive of people who engage with this term, radical Islamic terrorism. So as much as I don't think it's the right term, I think it is a big mistake for us as a policy, but also on a personal level, to not engage with people and not in a very nuanced way to try and disabuse them of some of these wrong ideas. So I think it's really, really important to engage as opposed to just be outright dismissive, because if we're just outright dismissive, I think we're putting ourselves on very bad footing.
Okay. Well, that brings us to the conclusion of this panel. Shall we have another round of applause for our panelists? Great job.